Okay. With respect to prescriptions, it's important to understand the role that prescriptions play, and I talked about this briefly before in the last video. When we're talking about prescriptions, anytime we're talking about prescriptions, it's important to understand what a prescription is. Remember, we said, I said before, that prescriptions are made by the oppressor for the oppressed, right? So prescriptions are basically enforced by the oppressor, right? Prescriptions are enforced, right, or dictated, mandated by the oppressor for the oppressed, right? So the oppressor prescribes, right? They come from the oppressor, and therefore they're direct. Oopsie. Sorry about that. They come from, and they're prescribed by the oppressor for the oppressed group, right? All right. So we understand that about prescriptions. Obviously, prescriptions maintain this power imbalance, right? Because I'm telling you what you need to do. When we're talking about prescriptions, there is the imposition of, right? There's the imposition of choice. And what does that mean? It seems like these two terms are contradictory, right? How can you have an imposition of choice, right? An imposition of choice is pretty simple to describe. It is the illusion of an opportunity. You can imagine that I am in control of some resources, and I give you the opportunity, right? And the opportunity is you can leave the land so that there isn't competition over this resource that we both need to survive, or I can destroy you, right? Well, there seems to be a sense in which I'm prescribing your behavior. The behavior that I'm attempting to prescribe is just leave the land, right? If you refuse to leave the land, then I'm going to destroy you. Then there's going to be conflict and you're going to die. So that there's this perception that you have a choice, but really what I'm doing is I'm imposing this choice, right? Either leave the land or, die to stay. And it's again, the attempt to maintain that power differential between the oppressor and the oppressed, right? It is yet again another sort of attempt to regiment this power imbalance. The next is the recipient of the prescription is forced to conform. Obviously, we know who the recipient of the prescription is, right? The recipient of the prescription is always going to be a member of the oppressed group. Well, anytime we're making this imposition, right, this prescription, it necessitates conformity, right? So another thing that you can say is that this prescription necessitates conformity, right? I'm telling you that you ought to do something, you should do something, but insofar as I'm making the suggestion, it really isn't a suggestion. I'm imposing my power. I'm prescribing behavior, and when that behavior conforms, then the prescription has been adhered to. When that behavior does not conform, then we escalate conflict, right? So that's the problem. The last point in prescription is that prescription controls the behavior of the oppressed, and that's obvious, right? Insofar as it prescribes, what is it prescribing? It's prescribing conformity, right? What is it prescribing the conformity of? It is prescribing the conformity of behavior. So the sort of the final analysis at this level with respect to prescription is that prescription, the act of prescription imposes conformity of behavior, right? So I'll actually write that down, right? So prescription imposes the conformity right? Prescriptions impose the conformity of behavior. So it's important to understand sort of the role, the function that prescriptions have in the relationship, in this soon-to-be dialectical relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed. The next bullet point refers to the process of freedom, right? And obviously, as I've said throughout the discussion, is the whole goal of Freire's account of the pedagogy of the oppressed, which we'll soon describe in detail. The whole goal is to attain a sense of liberation, a sense of emancipation through struggle, right? It's through the act of struggle that one attains this sense of liberation. And what we're going to do in this analysis is to further sort of systematize the sense in which this freedom is attained, right? Because, as he said, it's impossible for you to understand or even begin to conceptualize your emancipation, right? One of my favorite lines comes from Bob Marley's, I think it's Redemption song. Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery, none but ourselves can free our minds. That's the idea, right? It is my obligation as oppressed, right? It is my obligation as oppressed. It is furthermore my moral obligation as oppressed to free myself, right? My liberation, my emancipation cannot come as a consequence of someone else's generosity, right? We've talked in the last video, I talked in the last video about this idea of false charity and false generosity, right? My emancipation, my liberation has to come from my independent struggle and the uniform struggle of our collective group of oppressed people, right? So this is what Freire is sort of driving the point he's driving. Okay, the recognition then, now that we understand sort of the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed group, and we also understand the mode of liberation beginning with the act of recognizing one's oppression, then we can start to understand, right? We can start to talk about this situation, the situation that we're in, right? And the question is, well, what is the situation? Well, you can imagine, right? Just, put up all the sort of pedantic discussion and just think logically that you find yourself in a situation where you're emulating the practices of an oppressor. So the perfect example might be, let's say, domestic abuse. You're a young child. You live in a very, very abusive environment. Your father is abusing your mother. You see this practice day in and day out. You grow to be a man, and you find yourself engaged in exactly the same practice, right? You have become, you have sort of contributed to the oppression of an already oppressed group. The only way for you to sort of resolve this conflict that you have internally is to recognize your role as oppressor. And that's exactly what Gasset is saying on an international level, right? On a global level, right? The oppressed group have to recognize the situation of their oppression. So that's what we're going to discuss now, right? Is the situation of oppression. So the situation of... Alright, so the situation of oppression. The first point to note in the discussion of the situation of the oppression is that this can only overcome through the recognition of its causes, right? We can only, we being the oppressed group, can only overcome the situation of oppression insofar as we have recognized the cause of our oppression, right? So you have to think about sort of this logically now, right? And as we'll see in a little bit, for years he's pretty good with his logic, right? And his logic is actually very consistent. We can only overcome, we the oppressed group can only overcome through a recognition of the cause of our oppression. So you think about it, right? If we have oppression here, conceptually, what we need to do is we need to determine what this is. We need to bracket the cause, and C will just stand for cause, right? Cause of oppression. So we need to recognize the cause of our oppression. If we are here in an oppressed situation, a situation of oppressed, then those individuals in this situation, right, who are ourselves bracketed, right, and this would be the oppressed group, right, the oppressed, right, the oppressed find themselves in a situation, right, confined within a situation of oppression. The way that we break free, right, the way that we sort of break out of the situation of oppression, right, is by recognizing the cause of our oppression. If I recognize the cause of my oppression, then I have the necessary insight into destroying and dismantling the very thing that is impoverishing me, right? The very thing that is keeping me confined. I can't do that unless I understand, unless I move out, right? Unless I recognize the fact that I am in a cage, right? When I'm looking at the bars of the cage and I'm up close, I don't recognize, it's only when I step back to recognize the entire system, the entire sort of structure of the cage that I recognize my incarceration, right? The situation of my oppression. This is not an easy thing to do by any means, and luckily we have Freire to sort of walk us through the process of this recognition, right? Because it becomes habituated, right? We live our lives daily, we do our daily activities, we make the assumption that other people are living similar lives in a similar way, and it's only when we sort of meet someone or we recognize from the outside that, hey, what I thought was general for the world is really just unique to my situation. Why isn't it the case that he's living his life in that manner? Why is it the case that my life isn't more like that? I can start to now identify, right, through the differentiation and patterns, my oppression from someone else's liberation, right, or my oppression from someone else who's already began the process of struggle.